Welcome everyone, thanks for being here. We're here to talk about happiness, obviously, and I think one of the most commonly said things about happiness is that money can't buy it, right? We can't earn or buy or spend our way to a happy existence in this life. Is that true? I think all of us have seen probably numerous examples of human beings who have been very wealthy, very rich, and yet have lived what at least appeared from the outside to be rather sad, miserable, lonely, unhappy lives. And so I'm certainly willing to say, sure, maybe money doesn't guarantee happiness, more to it than that. At the same time, I wonder if I could wave a magic wand around the room today and make it so that tomorrow morning each of us would wake up as one of the richest people in the world. I wonder, would anyone not think like I would that the probability, that the likelihood of your future happiness might just be increased a little bit? I know I would be excited. I've seen all the research on happiness. I know how dangerous it is to think such a thing, and yet I can't help but feel that, give me a little bit more money, and there's problems that I'm going to be able to solve that I can't right now. There's people I can help that I couldn't otherwise. And I can't help but think that I might be a little bit happier as a result of that. So it's interesting, as I was researching this topic a few weeks ago, I came across a fact, a statistic, that as a person who sort of lives and swims in statistics all day, every day, this one truly stopped me in my tracks. This one stunted me. I haven't wrapped my head around it fully yet, despite meditating on it for a few weeks. If you make more than $32,000 a year, that places you in the 1% of the richest people in the world today. If you make more than $32,000 a year, you woke up this morning as one of the richest people in the world, at least according to the 99% of the human population who would consider you richer. There are 4.5 billion people in the world today, and 7.5 billion people in the world today. 7.425 billion people would represent that 99%. So as the 1% richest population in the world, I assume that most of us in this room are at least somewhere near that first percentile. Do any of us feel like we are reaping the benefits of our wealth? Do you feel as happy as you thought you might when I initially brought up this idea of being in that elite class? I mean, there are people in the world, a lot of them, billions of people in the world, who would look upon this Alaska Wellness Academy session as a gathering of the world's financial elite. And of course, we don't feel that way. I don't feel that way. And I think this reveals a key, important quality about happiness. Happiness is weird. It's not like other areas of health. It doesn't matter what I think or feel about my blood pressure. I could run all the data on my health or on your health. I could put you in scans and screens. I could say something very meaningful about how healthy you are after that. But I can't do the same thing with happiness. Happiness depends not just on what happens to us. It depends not just on what we have. It also matters how we feel and what we think about the circumstances of our lives. And it's possible for us to feel very differently about very different circumstances. That's why there are unhappy people living in the West Hills of Hollywood, and there are very happy people living in abject poverty. So happiness is this weird thing, and what we'll be doing today is really trying to explore that together, and ultimately trying to clarify how we should think about what really is a slippery, squishy subject, and ultimately how we can bring happiness to our organizations. I wonder, looking across the room today, how many of you would consider yourself among the happy today? Who here is happy? I see a lot of hands. Can I ask a follow-up question? Who raised their hand over here? I think you raised your hand. What's your name?
Oh, we knew this would happen in
Jamie.
the table.
Yeah, you made a huge mistake sitting here.
Oh, me?
Did you raise your hand, Jamie?
Yes.
Okay. how do you know that you're happy?
I can feel it.
You can feel it. Good, that's the perfect answer. So happiness is an inner experience characterized by positive thoughts and feelings. Feels good when we're happy. At the same time, there's this dimension of happiness that I think is weird. There's the type of happiness that I feel when I'm diving in, first scoop of a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And it's real, it feels good at that time, and yet that type of happiness I think is rather fleeting. It's not necessarily what we refer to when we talk about wanting to be happy. There's a deeper variety of happiness. And I think one of the problems that often occurs when we're pursuing happiness is that we can too easily settle or be tricked into a superficial level of gratification, sort of substituting in a cheaper form of happiness in place of what we're really longing for, which is something deeper. I'm going to share with you two, I think, really interesting, intriguing, and perplexing facts that science has uncovered about happiness, the first of which is referred to as the happiness paradox. And what the happiness paradox means is that there's this paradoxical thing that occurs if you really value and pursue happiness. If you decide, all I care about is being happy, I'm going to directly go out today and do whatever I can to be happy, it's far more likely, what research has shown, that you will end up less happy as a result of that. Happiness, it's been said, it's something like a butterfly, in that a butterfly might be sort of fluttering around you, and you might reach out and try to grab it and find that whatever you do, that seemingly slow, seemingly clumsy flying butterfly manages to evade your grasp. And then, of course, it's the moment you direct your attention to doing something else that you find that butterfly sort of floats in and lands on your shoulder. Happiness is elusive. Again, it's not like other areas of health. If I go out today and I decide today and every day forward I'm going to do all the things I need to do to be physically fit and physically healthy, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to accomplish that directly, assuming that I do what has to be done. The same can't be said of happiness. So we have to be careful with this, considering we came here today to talk about pursuing happiness in our organizations. The second piece of science that I think is interesting on happiness is referred to as the hedonic treadmill. Hedonic means sort of pleasure. Treadmill refers, of course, to running really fast and going nowhere. So what this graph on the screen here shows you is that you can have the best of circumstances occur. You could win the lottery. The most wonderful moments of your life can occur. And the worst things in life could happen to you. But given sufficient time, what tends to occur is we all sort of return to a baseline, to an equilibrium state of contentment. And actually, each of us has sort of a different equilibrium that's mostly informed by genetics, a fact that I found a little bit depressing, honestly, when I learned that. It doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't do things to promote our own psychological health and well-being. To the contrary. But it does speak to another one of those qualities about happiness that makes it a little bit difficult to grab hold of, to quantify. We have this incredible ability to acclimate to any circumstances. Again, this is why you find happy people in what appear to be the worst possible living conditions and unhappy people in the best. Given time, we acclimate. Given time, that house in the West Hills becomes like any other. So happiness is weird, but does that mean, again, that we should not care about happiness, that we should not value it, that we should not want it for our organizations? I don't think so, because the research suggests that having happy employees is an incredible competitive advantage. So thinking, I wonder what you might guess here. You don't have to yell it out, but what percentage of an organization's performance would you guess is attributed to employee satisfaction? And if I was a PhD in psychology, I might be able to tell you the difference between satisfaction and happiness. I'm sure there's something minute in the definitions, but I think there's significant overlap. If your employees are satisfied, it can mean up to 40% in a performance advantage or disadvantage if they're unsatisfied, which is absolutely monumental. Productivity has also been measured, comparing people who are happy, with people who are at a sort of baseline, with people who even are unhappy. And think of productivity sort of in terms of units per man hour. You can imagine somebody with a job where their job is to produce as many widgets in time as possible. And even in a position like that, you find that 12 to 20% of their productivity is variable depending on their state of happiness or satisfaction. So again, some real business value exists, as squishy and elusive as happiness may be. Finally, I wonder if any of you are familiar with or actually use the website Glassdoor.com. I want to say this website's been around for maybe a decade, and I can remember a time certainly when I didn't buy the value proposition of Glassdoor.com. I didn't think people would actually use it, and if they did, the results might be skewed and biased and corrupted. But so Glassdoor is a website where employees of a company can go on and rate their company like you would on Yelp if you were rating a restaurant, or TripAdvisor if you were rating your hotel stay. You can go on and rate your company. And Glassdoor has amassed over the years a significant amount of data of employee ratings. And then they've released that data to academic researchers who have then used it to try and figure out if there's anything that your rating on Glassdoor actually means. And sure enough, if your corporate rating on Glassdoor, and this would be applicable more to large organizations with a bigger sample size of ratings, but if your rating on Glassdoor is going up, it correlates strongly to increased profitability as a company, and the opposite is also true. And if you look just at the value of a company's total assets, an outcome or a measure that I think is maybe a few steps removed, you would think, from that Glassdoor rating, from employee satisfaction. This is the value of everything the company owns and does. You get somewhere in the neighborhood of a 10% increase with a single star rating on Glassdoor. So employee happiness obviously means something. It's obviously something we should care about. And really this boils down, I think, to a very simple explanation. And this is something we've been able to demonstrate more and more with all the modern neuroscience and brain scans and ways in which we can see what areas of the brain are firing up and when and why. Your brain works better when you're happy on almost every possible measure you can come up with. There's just a very few exceptions to that. People are more creative when they're happy. They're sharper. They're more resilient, a quality we talked about in the Alaska Wellness Academy, and one that I think is becoming more and more important to business leaders today. Our brains work better. And so happiness really does mean something. Again, chasing it like the butterfly in the sky may be to our detriment, but there's something here. Interestingly, I just came across this when looking for information on happiness online. There was a study done on physicians, and if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're experiencing medical symptoms, health symptoms, and you don't really know what's going on, and you need a diagnosis, it turns out that a happy physician is more likely, in fact 50% faster in diagnosing a condition, and they've found that a physician who's happy will apply about 3 times the amount of intellectual flexibility, which is precisely what you would want if you had a condition and you were looking to figure out what was going on. So I thought it was interesting just to see how that translated into the medical field. I also thought it was fun to see that some evil researchers out there have set up some block stacking competitions with little children. And with one group of children in a particular study, they took them aside and they primed them for positive emotions. And if you have small children, or if you've ever had small children, you probably know how easy it is actually to prime a child's emotions. I know I can get my son to say, "Oh my gosh," in about 5 seconds, no matter what the circumstances. But so in this block stacking competition, you had children sort of who were timed and measured for accuracy, and of course, the kids who were primed for happiness blew those other poor kids who didn't have that same experience out of the water. So again, just reiterating the point that happiness really means something. I'm not sure that what happens in a lot of our organizations every day is all too different from kids competing in a block stacking competition, actually. So I mentioned Andrew Sykes, and I think it's worth just noting that we've had an incredible privilege at the Alaska Wellness Academy for the last 3 years of hosting Andrew, who is one of the preeminent thinkers and certainly the best speaker I've ever seen at any wellness event. Andrew's model for thinking about and managing well-being in the workplace is, of course, by looking at human habits and how they sort of add up to create the types of outcomes that we like and often we don't like. Andrew's model is probably, it's certainly one of the best that I've come across and that I've been able to use as a student of worksite wellness, sort of desperately searching for better ways to do things for the last decade. However, I think some of us at least are probably ready for maybe a different way of looking at things, and indeed, there's a different model for thinking about and managing well-being that I think is particularly conducive to happiness, and that at least for me today, if I had to pick the one way, the one framework that I would suggest an employer use to orient themselves toward really and truly impacting health and well-being in the workplace, it would be that I would share with you today. I can also tell you I've not encountered a single employer who, at least before our encounter, was doing this. So I think this is a novel, non-conventional way of looking at wellness. We're basically going to do this by following in the footsteps of someone who totally flipped the script on his entire field. If you go back before the mid-1900s, the discipline, the field of psychology, was focused on one thing and one thing only, and that was all of the horrible things that can go wrong with the human mind. Psychological conditions from neurosis to psychosis to schizophrenia to a variety of other things we can't pronounce and never want to come in contact with. Images come to mind of the insane asylums of the 1900s. I think for understandable reasons, psychologists were obsessed with trying to figure these things out. They wanted to understand them and help these people. But around the mid-1900s, a few researchers, a few psychologists came along and said, this is a little bit of a subtle shift, but what if we started asking a different set of questions about the human mind? If instead of studying only the people who were sick and weak and ill, we shifted our attention to studying people who are actually thriving, the most vibrantly, psychologically healthy human beings in the world, might we not be able to understand what it is that has given them this seemingly vibrant, happy life? And might we not then be able to more effectively improve the psychology, the health and well-being of humanity in general, if we could unlock these secrets? So it was in this context that Abraham Maslow created his famous hierarchy of needs model. And of course, you probably encountered this in high school. If you go to HR conferences, every once in a while, this will come up, and for good reason. But I happen to believe that this is one of the most underappreciated ideas that I've ever come across. The hierarchy of needs is not necessarily a model for understanding or unlocking happiness, nor is it a model necessarily for understanding and unlocking health. I see it as something much bigger than that. It's a map for unlocking human potential. What the hierarchy of needs suggests is that our ability to operate, to become and to be the best possible version of ourselves is dependent on the satisfaction of a variety of different needs. Human beings have basic needs. And the word basic there can be a little bit misleading because I would say some of these needs are simple. We need food, water, and shelter, right? But some of these needs are a little bit squishy and hard to quantify, a bit like what we mentioned about happiness. As you move up this pyramid model, you get into the realm of psychological needs. So it turns out that just like human beings need food and water and shelter, we also need to be loved. We have to be loved. to be okay, to show up at all like the best possible version of ourselves. We have to feel like we belong to the people around us, to our family, to our friends, to our colleagues. We need to feel some level of connection and relationship and belonging with them. We need to feel important, and we need to feel valued. And ultimately, when you look up at that top level of the pyramid and you think about self-actualization, I define self-actualization as just becoming the best version of who you could possibly be. It's accessing that level of your potential. Easier said than done, but one thing that's very fascinating about this model and self-actualization and sort of this idea of reaching the pinnacle of your potential is that it seems one cannot necessarily do that until they begin to see themselves as not only being valuable, but being valuable in the context of something that matters to them that is bigger than them. It has to be bigger than you. So I think that's fascinating. Other fascinating things about Maslow's hierarchy that I think are particularly applicable today. I look around the world, and sure, at wellness seminars like this and in the work I do every day, we're concerned about diabetes. We're concerned about heart disease. All of the conditions we talk about all the time. But I look around today and I see something that to me is a little bit more concerning. It's darker, and it's a mental health crisis. It's an emotional health crisis. And just using this, this little Maslow pyramid as a lens to look at this problem, I think what I see is a world that has gotten really good at meeting our most basic physical needs. None of us in this room has likely struggled for sufficient food to eat or water to drink or shelter over our heads at any time in the recent past. But it's a much safer bet that a lot of us, even in this room, have struggled with many of these other psychological needs, because I would argue that society has actually gotten worse at taking care of us on that level. And in fact, we're surrounded by all sorts of that cheaper, gratifying form of happiness, represented by the pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. There's so many ways that we can numb and temporarily remove ourselves from the pangs of not feeling a sense of meaning, a sense of importance, that who we are and what we're doing in our lives matter. And so I think this goes a long way to explain what we're seeing in the world today. Suicides at a rate that I don't remember seeing before. So spending time with Maslow, I think, reveals a lot of things on a lot of levels that we care about when we talk about human health and wellness. I flipped the pyramid upside down here just to remind myself to make one point of clarification that I think Maslow, if he was alive today, he would appreciate. Maslow never drew a pyramid to represent his hierarchy. That was done by a silly consultant who wanted to help his corporate clients. And I think it's stuck for a reason. It's a perfectly fine way of relating to this idea of a hierarchy of needs. But what you don't want to fall into thinking is that you need to walk up this pyramid one level at a time, that a person who doesn't have food doesn't also need meaning. We really need all of these things all of the time. And one way to orient yourself as an employer, if you're thinking about how to satisfy the deeply felt but unmet needs your employees feel, first, it would be helpful to know what those needs are specifically. What are the key things your people might be struggling with as far as their basic human needs go? But then you can also look at what are the key things that we have in place as far as strengths in our organization that we can leverage and be particularly good at. So you don't have to move up this thing one step at a time. Now, coming in and talking about this high-level theory of human potential is one thing. Figuring out how to apply it in our organization, I recognize as an entirely different challenge. So what we're going to do is actually borrow from the story and the experiences and the simplified framework of a company called Joie de Vivre. Joie de Vivre, it's a funny name. It means joy of living. They were a hotel chain, sort of an eccentric hotel chain, as the name represents, with a lot of promise, led by a guy named Chip Conley, was their CEO. And that was when 9/11 happened. And following 9/11, we saw what would become the worst economic market conditions for hotels in the United States ever. Hotels started dropping like flies because people weren't traveling. Joie de Vivre was in a double bind because they had a French name. And if you'll think back to that period of time, we weren't too happy with the French and their response after 9/11, and so we started calling things freedom fries, freedom toast. So Chip Conley was in this really state of despair when he wandered, of course, into the public library, and what did he find but Abraham Maslow and his work. And what he, I guess, determined that day was that whatever happened would happen. He was going to, from that point forward, develop his entire business around making people happy, starting first and foremost with his employees. And to do that, he took all those different steps out of the Maslow pyramid, and he simplified it into just 3 tiers, which we're going to talk about after we take a little break here soon. And those 3 tiers are represented by very actionable, practical, realistic ways that an employer can go about meeting those needs. You're probably wondering why there's a toilet on the screen. Chose this for a reason. Just to establish the credibility of what Joie de Vivre and Chip Conley did using Maslow at their company. In that economic climate I described, their company multiplied by 5 times. They grew 5 times while other hotels were falling off. Their turnover at that time was 25%. The industry average, maybe even still today for hotels, particularly in positions where you're forced to deal with dirty bathrooms, one third of Joie de Vivre's employees, and 3,000 some employees, clean toilets for a living. And they reduced their turnover to 25%. Industry average was 75 to 100%. So there was something truly remarkable happening here when you can take people who clean toilets for a living and convince them that what they do matters, that who you are is important, and you are here to accomplish something that matters. So we're going to explore this further. We're going to get into practically applicable principles and ideas that you can take back to your organization based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we will figure out, I hope, how to identify and take care of potentially unmet needs that people are feeling in their lives today that you might argue sit even a level below the behavior that we're always focusing on changing, and that people might even appreciate a little bit more if we went about trying to fulfill their needs as opposed to changing their behavior. So I'll leave you with that idea. I have a 4-year-old son at home, and there's a book that we often read together. It's a fantastic children's book. I mean, probably the book that I'm most proud to have and that I would most recommend to other families. It's called How Full Is Your Bucket Today? Has anybody read this book by chance? Yeah, we have a couple people. So this fabulous book is used to teach kids to imagine that everybody in the world is walking around with an invisible bucket. They're carrying an invisible bucket. And of course, that bucket represents how happy they are at any given moment. And the way that we can live our lives is by going around and filling people's bucket, by making them happier. And when we do, we in turn receive more into our own bucket. So my son relates to this immediately. He picked it up immediately. He knew exactly what it meant to fill someone's bucket, that it was to do something nice for them. But then recently it started to backfire. Now, because I often have to be a parent and not just a friend to my son, anytime that he's watched a little too much TV or he's outside a little bit too late, it's time to go to bed and I have to establish the boundary, he sees this as emptying his bucket. He says, "Daddy, you just emptied my bucket." And so I find myself in a funny predicament given the topic today, what we've been talking about, and that I'm not really sure how to explain to him the difference between not getting what you want and having an empty bucket, we'll say, being unhappy. So I mentioned that Chip Conley at Joie de Vivre created a simplified, more practical version of Maslow's pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy, which you see represented on your screen now. He took the safety, the basic level needs here at the bottom, and basically said, you know what? The way that I can make my people feel safe is really by compensating them financially, by supporting their financial health and well-being. And it's all about money. On the emotional, the need to be loved, the need to feel valued and important level, he said really the way that we're going to accomplish that in a workplace is with recognition. We need to recognize people's contributions and the esteem will come. And then finally, when it comes to self-actualization, I mentioned that there's something about truly and fully becoming the best possible version of ourselves that requires us to be connected to this higher cause, a purpose bigger than ourselves. That level is all about meaning. And I think the conversation we're going to have about meaning today may be the most interesting. And we could probably do a whole nother academy on this topic in the future. I'm going to start with money, and I'm going to move through this relatively quickly because some of you have already attended an Alaska Wellness Academy event this year focused on financial wellness. And I don't want to drag you through another one. Of course, if you didn't make that session, there's a lot of good content that Andrew Sykes presented on financial wellness. And in fact, I'm going to borrow 2 of his slides just to quickly refresh us on what it means to be financially well and unwell. Also, the state of Alaska, you can see a few statistics on your screen, you could argue, is maybe in a slightly below average position as far as the environmental conditions go when it comes to supporting financial wellness. There are some things here that are uniquely difficult for people when it comes to maintaining financial security. Medical premiums there at the bottom jump out particularly high. So this is obviously something that we need to be thinking about in this state in particular. As Maslow suggested when he was creating his model, if we have a deeply felt but unmet need, we're hardwired to try and fulfill that need. It's what we're doing with our lives. And so it's no surprise that you find that someone coming to work who is financially insecure is not working as much. They're trying to solve for this problem that they're experiencing. And so research has shown that, yeah, up to 3 productive days, sleep, stress, I mean, there's so many things that result from this that are detrimental to organizational performance. When it comes to what we can do about money, the first one, I hate to even say, it's obvious, though there is a nuance here that I think is interesting. Companies like Joie de Vivre and many other companies that I've studied on this topic tend to all say the same thing about paying frontline employees more. Sure, you need to pay your employees as much as you possibly can, as much as you can to make money not an issue, ideally. But with respect to frontline employees, it seems that a lot of these very successful companies with success stories to tell, they seem to always try to set themselves a little bit above market if they can when it comes to their frontline employees. So maybe there's something there. Thought that was interesting. Another rather obvious recommendation is simply designing benefits that I think first and foremost eliminate the catastrophic downside that each of us might otherwise have without, for example, a health insurance policy. We need to be in a position where we don't have to worry about ruin or life is always going to be a little bit frightening. So we need to put that into place, and then obviously saving for retirement, ensuring one's future. You see all sorts of interesting benefits coming out now. Starbucks now has put into place a child care benefit you may have heard of in the news. I think that was 2 weeks ago. If you're a Starbucks employee, you now have access up to 10 paid days of emergency child care. You can sort of get on the phone and talk to a concierge who will help set that up for you. So you can see how, I don't know if anyone at Starbucks has Maslow's hierarchy on their wall in their office, but you can see how some companies are taking a sort of orientation toward employee needs and figuring out how you can take care of these things to release people to be themselves fully and completely at work. The third bullet here on your screen is what we talk to our clients about most. Education on financial wellness and money-related topics. I sort of see it as compensating for an educational system, an environment that may prepare us for many things in life, but managing our money well doesn't seem to be one of them. I know that I escaped my formal education with little idea of how to manage my personal finances. Certainly not any lessons that I didn't probably take from family and friends that I was lucky enough to have around. It's very easy to escape a formal education in this country without understanding what compound interest is. There's at least a quote that is attributed to Einstein I don't know if he actually said it, but saying that compound interest is the most powerful force in the world, essentially. It's, exponential growth curves are sort of counterintuitive for our brains to process, I think. But teaching our employees about things like this is a little bit unconventional, and yet it's an opportunity because the world has not taught them these things, and they are out there managing their money poorly to their detriment. There's no doubt that when it comes to our need for financial security, we are all pretty much our own worst enemies. That isn't to say we're in it alone. There are plenty of people out there who are trying to take our money, trying to rid us of the ability to be financially secure. So that's all I'm going to spend on money, because I think we have two more interesting and certainly more novel topics to discuss here. Recognition, when we think about recognition, we really have to start on the level of one's manager, because it is our manager to whom, most of the time we are looking for approval. If they don't value us, if they don't see our contributions, if they don't think that they're important, then we're not going to be happy in our job. And so managers play an absolutely pivotal role. And I just thought I would highlight that by sharing a statistic. We saw what percentage of corporate performance is attributable to employee satisfaction. 70% of employee satisfaction is attributable to your relationship with your manager. And much of that relationship quality is going to come down to them really and truly seeing you and what you do well and helping you cultivate your strengths. So recognition on the manager level is extremely important. I thought this was kind of a funny study on this topic, and I wanted to share it with you. I can't imagine what it was like in this workplace when they contrived this experiment and what the employee may or may not have known about it. But some researchers went into a company. They took a single individual and isolated them and had managers recognize what they did using good recognition and feedback methods. And they did this for 21 days and then basically looked to see if there was any difference in their performance before and after. And indeed, not surprisingly, you see a 31% improvement in employee productivity. Now, one of the best principles that I've come across, if there's one thing that you can sort of set as your North Star when it comes to recognizing employees, and really this is one of those life lessons that I think applies everywhere. The founder of Mary Kay Cosmetics taught this to all of her people, including her salespeople. If you've ever worked in sales, you may have heard something similar to this, and you know how powerful it is. We're all vulnerable to flattery. And Mary Kay basically told her people to imagine that everyone you see, they're not carrying an empty bucket or an invisible bucket, but they have a sign around their neck that says, "Make me feel important." It speaks right to what Maslow was saying about that being a basic human need, but it's a need that I think we often overlook. Everyone we come in contact with, and especially the people who work with us and for us, need us to make them feel important if we want them to show up as the best possible version of themselves. So this is a fantastic principle, something to keep top of mind if at all possible. One of the really growing and I think seemingly very effective methods that employers today, you could call it an innovation, I guess, but employers are rolling out peer-to-peer recognition programs in droves, it seems, today. Primera has one that I'll talk about here, but the value of a peer-to-peer recognition program is simply that one individual or one leadership team cannot observe nor recognize and reward and reinforce all of the different behaviors that are going on across an organization day in and day out. And so the ability to distribute and empower people to recognize one another puts you in position to exponentially increase the amount of good behaviors that are being reinforced in the workplace. It also means that instead of receiving just a reward from HR or from some leader in the company that I may not have ever spoken with, who may not really know my contribution, you're being rewarded by the people who are around you, who know your strengths, they know your faults, they know your work ethic, and they're not going to be inclined to tell you that you did something really well and that they appreciated it if there wasn't something there. So it's meaningful when we're rewarded by our peers. One company that Daniel Pink wrote about in the book Drive, if you've read the book Drive, it's one of those sort of bestseller, popular HR reader books in the last decade. Daniel Pink talked about an architecture firm called Kimley Horn and Associates. And this is probably the most liberal of the peer-to-peer recognition programs I've encountered, but I'm sort of inspired by it. They basically empowered any employee at any time to award a $50 bonus to any other employee for anything that they might have done that was valuable to the company, that deserved recognition. They freed people up. And as far as I've been able to tell, it hasn't backfired on them. I think a lot of us would be maybe a little bit worried about rolling this out in our companies. It certainly depends on the climate in your company, the relationship you have with your employees. But there's power there. There's something to it. Now at Premera, for the past 2 years, we have a quarterly recognition program that's similar, but maybe scaled back a little bit, not quite as liberal. We each get a $10 Amazon card once a quarter. It comes with a little opportunity to write a thank you note to the person we give it to. But we can also put those notes online on our intranet so that you're not just thanking a person with a meaningful little gift, something they can use, but you're also sort of spreading the positive emotions that result from sharing words of gratitude and recognition with someone. So you can sort of multiply the impact of something like that by sharing those messages. I want to share 2 really good habits of recognition. This fits really well in the context of what we've long talked about at the Alaska Wellness Academy, which is the power of habits and how to design habits into our workday so that they become part and parcel of what we do and how we do it. You open your email box every morning. It's a perfect opportunity. Anything you do every day is the perfect opportunity to build a habit into that process. What would the most successful person in the world do when they open their email inbox every day? Certainly one of the best recognizers in the world would write a quick note, a quick email. Keep it short, simple, and sweet to a colleague, send it off, and every day in practicing this habit, you've practiced an incredibly valuable recognition methodology that's going to help take care of those basic needs for esteem that your people have. So I love this one. I also like this one. If you're part of a leadership team or a management team of any kind, you have people working for you. This one comes directly from Chip Conley at Joie de Vivre, actually. If you can just take the last 10 minutes of a meeting, again, we all have meetings. They're perfect opportunities to build in effective habits for performance. If you can take those last 10 minutes and each leader goes around the table, around the room, and just brings up the contribution of someone on their team that the other leaders may not have been aware of, it allows not only for people to know at the leadership level what's going on in the organization that's worth knowing, and they may even reach out to that person themselves and say, wow, thank you. Thank you for doing that. We rarely come in contact with each other, but I value your contribution. It's a powerful habit. But if you can think of something you've seen, something you've observed in your workplace that maybe deserved a little extra recognition you haven't given yet. So I have a colleague named Julie. She's been with our team for maybe a year. And what I like about Julie, and this has showed up many times recently, but she's a person who, regardless of what you're trying to accomplish, she doesn't show up as her job title. She doesn't show up concerned with the specific things that she, according to her title, is supposed to do or not do. She shows up trying to get things done. And so because of that attitude, she's helped me out many times in recent history. And so I will have to tell her that when I get back. Just a few more high-level principles to think about when we talk about recognition in the workplace. You could say there's 2 kinds of recognition, formal and informal. Your company may have formal rewards of some kind, and those are absolutely a great thing to have. They help reinforce the company's high-level goals, the key things that you want people to be doing. So you always want to have those in place. Just as an aside, one thing it seems like I'm always recommending to clients with whom I consult, as far as formal recognition programs go, a lot of companies are, they're rewarding their top salesperson. They may be rewarding their top manager, their top CSR, top customer service person. But there's a lot of things that people do that go a long way to make the workplace a better place, a happier place, contributions to culture, contributions to health and wellness even. And I never find companies that are rewarding people for those things. They're out there, but they're few and far in between. These are the pioneers. So it's something to think about as far as formal recognition programs go. Informal recognition is the stuff that's happening more spontaneously. So it's not as structured, it's informal by definition. But you want to have some of that going on too. And if you have an imbalance, one of these things more than the other, it can create some adverse outcomes. It's less than optimal. So something to think about. It's a well-known adage that you should praise people publicly, criticize them privately. I think it holds true. That doesn't mean that there's no value or that you shouldn't ever praise people privately. It just means that people often do, if you have a company newsletter or if you have an all-hands meeting and somebody's name gets brought up, they've got that sign around their neck, they're carrying their invisible bucket, and they're going to be moved by that. That's just how we are. So it's good practice to make sure you're praising people publicly at least sometimes. Finally, and this is going to set us up for our next activity, something a little bit unlike, I think, anything we've done at an Academy event. And Andrew Sykes has talked about this in the past. But when we recognize somebody, when we give them feedback of any kind, it's incredibly important that we're very specific about exactly what it is that they've done right or exactly what it is that they could do better. We talk about constructive feedback. Both types of feedback are critical for importance. One is a little bit more important. We talk about a person feeling recognized and esteemed. The most common objection, the most common excuse that we give when we don't recognize people well enough or often enough is that we don't have time. But actual research has shown what I think, really if you sit and reflect on it a little bit, you might find to be true, which is that there's a larger ROI, there's a bigger return on investment from recognition than there is from really any other activity. I had to bring up the idea of paying your employees more if you can. Obviously, that's not possible in every situation. The way you're compensating your employees is based on a variety of other circumstances and real limitations. But recognition is essentially free. And there was one study that showed this by dividing up their employee population into two groups. One group got a meaningful pay raise. The other group got a recognition program. And the impact on employee engagement, at least, which is what they measured in this study, was pretty similar. But of course, the engagement or the recognition program cost 95% less. So there's undoubtedly real value to be found there. We're going to talk about meaning. I've already mentioned that meaning seems to have this relationship to something bigger than ourselves. It's the thing that we get when we're focused on something that is not necessarily our own gratification. Interestingly, if we refer back to the conversation we had at the beginning of the session today about directly pursuing happiness, the happiness paradox, the fact that can actually make us less happy, what a lot of leading psychologists are promoting today is the idea that instead of directly pursuing happiness, you should directly pursue meaning. Because really that's a way to get out of your own head, the weight of your own depression or anxiety or whatever it is that's driving you to be so focused on happiness, and to sort of transcend that state of affairs. We're going to learn about meaning from the man who I think it's fair to say wrote the book on meaning. The book Man's Search for Meaning was written by Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychologist who was practicing as a psychologist in Austria when the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. He was also Jewish, and so you can imagine what ended up happening. He spent time in Auschwitz. He spent time in 2 other concentration camps. He experienced all of the horrors that we know to have gone on in those places. And fortunately for us and for the world, Viktor Frankl survived. Interestingly, it was the way that he survived, it was the reason for which he would tell you he survived that ended up becoming this incredible insight that he was able to take out of the concentration camps and share with the world. All other things being equal, Viktor found, first of all, he was a psychologist, and so he couldn't help but in these concentration camps observe what was happening around him from the perspective of a psychologist. He was interested in the impact of these circumstances on the human mind. And what he found is, all other things being equal, the people who were more likely to survive the camps were the people who had a connection to some future vision that they were so deeply interested in and committed to that they couldn't let it go. Some higher purpose. There was something left for them to do with their lives that they couldn't give up so easily. That was the thing. This has been confirmed, it's been proven and demonstrated in countless studies since Viktor Frankl observed it himself in the worst possible of environments. It's interesting, he talks about, it's not just the question of survival to survive, how to survive, but why to survive, what for. You could say that a similar question is being asked in a lot of our heads and a lot of our employees' heads in the workplace every day. It's not just what to do at work or how to do it, but why to do it. And it really seems, and if you've encountered by chance any of Simon Sinek, who has one of the most popular TED Talks, work on starting with the why, the importance of a why, it would seem that this is essential. If we want to talk about accessing human potential, accessing higher performance, and even just health and well-being, it seems that it's essential that we have some kind of why that we're connected to. And what a powerful idea. Another man who's experienced some pretty terrible circumstances in his life is Tom Rath. He's a health and wellness writer, has done some work for the Gallup organization. He was diagnosed with a terminal illness, I want to say a decade ago, maybe longer. Through some magical circumstances, he's actually survived that. He continues to live and work and produce great work today. I love this statement here. I think this is the perfect way of orienting ourselves to how we create meaning. It comes down to our strengths and interests, our employees' strengths and interests, and the needs of the world, and lining those two things up as well as we can. I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a call center. One of my first jobs was in a call center, and I would take it any day over cleaning toilets, but it's a difficult job. In fact, I remember in that job, I sort of made meaning out of the fact that I had an opportunity to connect with so many different people, most of them experiencing a problem, and I had an opportunity to help them every day. But these are difficult work environments, and an interesting study was done on some call center employees who had an even more difficult job than I did. These were the people who are calling you at 6 p.m. when you're sitting down for dinner at your family and asking you for money. The people in this study were specifically raising funds for student scholarships. And some researchers went into this call center. They broke the employees into 3 different groups. There was a control group they did nothing with. With one group, they had former employees, former people who had done this job, come in and talk about what the job did for them in their lives. You get all these benefits, you get paid well. This job led me to this other position, which led me to this other very successful position. There are a lot of things to like about your job. They brought these people in to tell that story. For the other group, they brought in people who had received scholarships funded by these phone calls, by these people making these phone calls, so that they could actually connect with the fruits of their labor. If you've ever had to pick up the phone and make a cold call, even a sales call, it's hard. And it was fascinating to see that this group who was able to connect with the fruits of their labor, who were able to see and talk to people who had benefited from this work, ended up outperforming the control group and the group that focused on the more selfish, if you will, perks of this job. Perhaps even more interesting is how this has shown up, this same effect, in other fields and other disciplines. Radiologists, they go to school as much as any other type of physician, maybe more than some of them. But unlike most physicians, they spend a lot of time not interacting directly with patients. There are actually big radiology practices in Hawaii. Come live in Hawaii, live in paradise, and sit in a room and read images here instead of Ohio or wherever else you might choose to practice. These are highly trained, highly educated people sitting in front of computer screens all day. That doesn't make them particularly uncommon, but it makes them unique among physicians. Fascinatingly, what studies have found is that if you show a radiologist a picture of the human being whose scan they're reading, they will more accurately read those scans. They will find things, there will be fewer false positives or false negatives in those scans. And what I found is this is translated into other fields as well. Even one was lifeguards. If you introduce lifeguards to people who've been saved by a lifeguard, then there's a performance-enhancing effect from that. So how do we bring this effect to our organizations? How do we align what we do with the needs of the world in a way that is compelling? This is an especially important question if your company does not exist to pursue some sort of charitable, obviously higher purpose. If you just manufacture widgets, how do you convince your employees that what they do matters? A really interesting, I think, brilliant example of how to do this comes from the Geek Squad at Best Buy. If you're not familiar with the Geek Squad, they fix computers. They open up monitors and laptops, they swap out gears, and they're done. And so how do you convince these people that what they're doing really and deeply and truly matters to the world? Best Buy came up with this statement. And really, there's probably not a company in the world that couldn't say this same thing about what they do. The economy consists of all sorts of interrelated players, each doing maybe just a small piece. But to some extent, what we do probably adds up in a big way, at least if not directly, then indirectly, to change the world in some sort of positive way. And so if we can come up with a story to tell our people, a way of articulating the value of what we do, why it matters, then we offer them a chance to experience a deeper and more complete and fulfilling sense of meaning. This is going to be our final little activity. It's going to be kind of hard, I think, but maybe kind of fun. This is another thing that I borrowed from Chip Conley at Joie de Vivre, who created a 2-word mantra for his company. It's great to try and articulate a powerful vision statement, mission statement, something that positions what you do and why it matters. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a long and eloquent paragraph. We're going to see if we can boil it down to just 2 words. In 2 words, can you encapsulate what your company does and why it matters? And I'll give you 2 examples. Both come from Chip Conley. At Joie de Vivre, his 2-word mantra was create joy. Creating joy is what they set out to do, and that's really how they oriented themselves. Chip eventually went to Airbnb. He was handpicked by the CEO of Airbnb to lead operations there. And at Airbnb, if you've ever used one of these services, it's pretty incredible. Their mantra was belong anywhere. If we can make people feel at home anywhere, then we've achieved our purpose. So I work with Vivacity, obviously. We're a health and wellness service company. And I don't know that our clients necessarily would use these 2 words to describe us, but what I put down for our mantra was humanize work. I think this is maybe biased a little bit toward what we've been talking about today, but to me, what it means to humanize the workplace is to shift our orientation a little bit away from what it arguably has been in the past. The industrial economy, the industrial paradigm of work sort of created business people who are highly trained to focus on the mechanics, the technical side of their businesses. And interestingly, it seems that over the past half century or so, the economy has shifted to this point where today we are more reliant on human capabilities than ever before. We need people to bring the full spectrum of their strengths and skills to work every day, more than ever. And I think that also means we need to be thinking a lot more than we have in the past about what their very human needs are and how we can satisfy them. So humanize work is what I came up with. One thing that Chip Conley talks about in his TED Talk, I encourage all of you to go out and look for Chip Conley's TED Talk if you've enjoyed hearing some of the things from his experience at Joie de Vivre today. He talks about the country of Bhutan and how they started measuring gross national happiness as an alternative to gross domestic product. A really interesting idea. And there was a formula and I'm going to butcher it if I try to say it verbatim, for happiness that they came up with, Bhutan. But the basic idea was that happiness flows not from wanting what you don't have, but from wanting what it is that you do have. And when I think of wanting what it is that I do have, I think of the term gratitude.